Dear organizers of the conference, dear colleagues and audience, I'm sorry that I could not attend personally uh, the conference that I was very much looking forward to participate. I especially regret not to be in Fez, as Fez is the oldest university in the world with Al-Qarawiyyin, and therefore it would have been a great pleasure to be amongst you and to exchange and to get into conversation. But today I received the results of a corona test, and I would not like to infect all of you. So I recorded my talk here back in Germany. African universities are guided by European and American methodological standards in order to gain international recognition, rather than relying on their own ontologies, epistemologies, and sensory regimes to develop their own methodological standards. According to Botswanan cultural psychologist Seth Opong, this opens up the guiding question of my talk: who can speak on behalf of the human and whose perspective is heard? In an ideal world, all humans can, regardless of their cultural and social background. But the world is not a fair British debating club where different positions are exchanged in friendly dispute. Today, sciences worldwide are deeply guided by ontological presuppositions and epistemological interests that were developed in the West, spread across the globe through powerful institutions and political processes. The intellectual genealogical tradition continues to correspond to hegemonic classifications in the West, as well as in many counter-movements that position themselves as post-colonial. Even though they may be called voices of the Global South, it is noteworthy that post-colonial intellectuals cited in this paper have mostly either been socialized in Western institutions or succeeded there professionally. Ella Shohat, for example, is the daughter of Iraqi Jews working at NYU. Pradeep Chakrat is a Malayan Indian studying in Germany and working at the University of Bochum. Manvir Singh was born in Edison, New Jersey, studied at Harvard and Brown, and holds a position at Davis. Sethapong is Nigerian, studied in Liberia and South Africa, and holds a position in Gaborone. Tuhiwai Smith, besides her name, is only to a minor part of Maori descent. However, there is no doubt that New Zealand is a Western country in the Global South. And Zuliferi Huhuteni is a Jaguar shaman from the northwestern Amazon rainforest. So who is West, who is Global South? Both classifications, I would argue, have blind spots, which my contribution will focus on. The assertion of a monolithic West and a Western perspective ignores the diversity, the fissures and breaks within what constitutes the West, should it even exist. But well, it does exist, and it is a weird perspective. A look to pedagogy clarifies that. Behavioral scientists routinely, for example, publish broad claims about human psychology and behavior in the world's top journals based on samples drawn entirely from the West, from educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies. Researchers often implicitly assume that either there is little variation across human populations or that these standard subjects are as representative of the species as any other population. In particular, it's about the Western and more specifically American undergraduates who form the bulk of the database in the experimental branches of psychology, cognitive science, and economics, as well as allied fields. So argue psychologists Henrik Heine and Naren Zayan in an article published in 2010. This is what Opong and other scientists criticize. non-Western knowledge about psychology and psyche are largely ignored. As an example, from my own discipline, the annual review of anthropology only lists texts written in English, mainly by US anthropologists, thereby upholding the fantasy that only this is what counts scientifically and universally, without ever naming themselves universal. If American students and publications are weird, with the advent of artificial identity, those weird perspectives will be strengthened and petrified because artificial intelligence will not be fed by the knowledge of an argan entrepreneur in Morocco, a deer herder in Mali, a textile worker in Bangladesh, or even a homeless person in Germany. But not only non-Western knowledge will be neglected by artificial intelligence, but also ruptures competing designs, regional and ethnic counter images within the West. The dichotomy between West and Global South is based on purification processes that create the dichotomy in the first place by shortening, excluding, objecting, or omitting the history of the enrichment and interconnections of diverse worldviews. I will illustrate that with the research of cultural historian Ella Shohat, who has analyzed an artifact from the Mediterranean, the so-called blackamoor. A lot of energy and creativity had to be invested by Italians in the 16th and 17th century to separate the cultural entanglements themselves with other parts of the Mediterranean and to separate and create a Western from a non-West. She says a hybrid of the African black and the Muslim Moor, the blackamoor figure condenses representations often conceptualized in isolation within the compartmentalized cartographies of the various areas. That is, scrutiny of the blackamoor in this sense helps shed light on forgotten discursive continuities as well as on historical connectivities across continents and oceans, in this case, those operating along the winding Mediterranean shores of Europe, Africa, and Asia. The figure not only presents the other as mixed and altered, but also positions its owners, the Italians of the 16th and 17th century, in a sphere that cleanses themselves of their own mixtures, culturally, historically, linguistically, religiously, and possibly even in terms of origin and kinship. So purity is always the result of a process of purification. This in mind leads to an unpleasant question. How convincing is the assumption that there is a view from the global south? To my mind, there is no view from the global south, but from global souths in plural. Outside the West is not just Russia and China, not just the BRICS countries as a group, but powerful actors like Indonesia, Turkey, Qatar, and Morocco, the Emirates, with their own foreign policy and agendas. What they have in common is their common point of reference against Western hegemony. But what else connects India's geopolitical interests with those of Turkey, or Brazil's with those of Nigeria? Many proponents of indigenous worldviews assume that these exist as self-sufficient, uninfluenced, and, in a sense, unpolluted designs, thereby following the Western narrative of pure identities and identification. According to cognitive and evolutionary anthropologist Manvir Singh, anthropologists and social theorists argue that our concept of indigeneity is bound up with outdated ideas about so-called primitive peoples. The tropes persist. We have merely replaced one set from the other. And Singh goes on, indigeneity as a project of hope was crafted by enterprising activists over years of strategizing, absorbing ideas from red power, third worldism, African and Asian anti-colonialism, and the environmental movement. People saw the politics of the oppressed, aiming to protect land and sovereignty to turn backward natives into respected stewards. The resurrection of primitiveness, he goes on, is just as much a testament to the stickiness of a trope. The idea of the primordial savage is appealing, a symbol of everything modernity is not. It serves as a foil for decrying civilization, corruption, or for celebrating its achievements. But we cannot escape the colonial inheritance when we insist on summoning its ghosts. This statement, and I'm sorry, it's in German, certainly needs critical reflection based on empirical evidence. In October 2025, Survival International, an NGO focusing on the protection of uncontacted ethnic groups, listed about 200 of them. And uncontacted does not mean no contact, but it does mean that these groups who know about the outer world consciously decided for different reasons, mainly to protect themselves from diseases, international corporations, and the like, to reject all kind of contact. Could they be the authentic voices from the global south? However, the application of conventional social science methods is not only about the objection of systematic non-European approaches to knowledge, but also often with the best and most unerring intentions about the hypostasization of one's own approaches, according to New Zealand pedagogue Tuhiwai Smith. Many researchers, she says, academics and project workers may see the benefits of their particular research projects as serving a greater good for mankind or serving a specific emancipatory goal for an oppressed community. Pradip Chakravarti, Indian cultural psychologist, rejects the idea of indigeneity as a scientifically relevant analytical tool. Freudian psychology, for example, is based in and on specific historical and cultural contexts, such as Vienna at the turn of the 19th to 20th century. In other words, it is as indigenous, in this case Viennese, than any approach from a scholar outside of the Western realm. Rather than turning the table around and rejecting Western perspectives in their entirety altogether, it is important to historicize and culturalize them. Otherwise, they will be transformed into something like a universal wisdom. First, culturalization, which means reculturalization of the terminology, methods, and epistemologies developed in North America or in Europe, and now dominant in many disciplines worldwide. These are rarely recognized, named, and discussed as culture-specific approaches. In psychology, for example, the term indigenous psychology was instead developed for a non-hegemonic, non-Western method of understanding and healing. Second, historization. We have to rehistoricize central concepts such as culture and nation. Both in their complete understanding are products of the 19th century. Diverse populations were loyally bound to the respective dynasty and the pre-national and feudal state in Europe. In the process of nation-state formation, cultural homogeneity within and demarcation from the outside became the glue that was intended to bind the population together, not just in Europe, also in the Ottoman Empire, for example. If we do not culturalize, historicize, we dispossess people from other times and spaces of their specific ways of coping with existence. They ensure that these are perceived only in relation to the Western self-evident truths, thereby perpetuating hegemony. A genuine voice from the global south, if we do want to keep the category alive, is Juliferi Hukuteni, a 63-year-old Jaguar shaman from the northwestern Amazon rainforest. He criticizes, I do not like the fact that they do research, the researchers, and then leave. They take photos and ask people in the village about medical plants or stargazing. In my opinion, all researchers must publish books in our language and leave teaching materials for our schools. Because he recognizes that the knowledge of his own culture could be lost over the next generations. And while researchers may have written articles and books, some knowledge could be lost in his society. He says, by giving back, I mean that their knowledge is accurately represented and that where appropriate aspects that should not be shared outside their own culture are not shared with Western society. Huhuteni adds an aspect to the question: who can speak for humans that needs to be given deeper understanding? What is a human after all? In his world, as anthropologists have described, humans are not the only beings in the world that form part of their social and cultural life. Ancestral spirits, animals, plants, landscapes, the wind, water, and so on. And Jnun, if we stick to Northern Africa, they dispossess a personal character just as humans, and they are part and parcel of their culture and humanity. So if we are serious with our endeavor to cultural diversity, we have to question our own cosmologies. Maybe this will lead to distortion, to fear, to bliss, or whatever. It would be interesting how jaguars, geese, waterfalls, or Socotra trees talk about humans. Because they do. Geese, for example, communicate amongst themselves about hunters whom they see. Jaguars communicate about humans, how to avoid them, or how to hunt them, or how to fight them. So maybe it would not be bad to add these beings into the question: who can speak for and about humanity? So who can still speak on behalf of the humans, and for Huhuteni, non-humans in all our diversities? But no one has the truth, because we all speak from our cultural, historical, and social backgrounds and perspectives. To my mind, the more important question is not who can speak on behalf of the human, but how we can speak about them. Thank you.